Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine, you're running, not from something trivial, but running to save your very life. You're running through a dark forest, barefoot, with branches scratching your skin and stones cutting your feet. Behind you, the threat of chains and lashes follows like a shadow. In front of you, nothing but darkness and a desperate hope for freedom. That was the reality for thousands of enslaved people in 19th century America. They had no freedom, no names of their own, no future. They were bought and sold like objects. And when they tried to escape, the entire system labeled them criminals. But in the thick of that darkness, small lights flickered. Lights few people remember today. These lights weren't politicians, weren't warriors on a battlefield. They were simple, quiet folks who opened their doors at midnight, gave a stranger a piece of bread, a drink of water, and, most importantly, a chance at freedom. They were the Quakers. No guns, no marches, no banners waving in the wind, just doors quietly opening in the dead of night, simple acts of kindness, and an unshakable belief that every person deserves to be free. This is not the story of grand revolutions or famous heroes. It's the story of those who chose to risk everything in silence, so that others might live. In the early 19th century, America stood divided, not only by geography, but by something much deeper, a line that split the country between freedom and slavery. In the South, the economy depended on enslaved people. Millions of men, women, and children forced to live as property, denied the right to their own lives. Families torn apart, names erased, dignity stolen. If they tried to run, the law itself would hunt them down. In the North, things seemed different. There was no legal slavery. But that didn't mean everyone was willing to speak out. Most people remained silent, too afraid, too indifferent, or too comfortable to care. And then there was a small group of people who stood apart. A group who lived quietly, avoided political battles, but who believed one thing so fiercely, so clearly, that it shaped everything that they did. Every human being carries within them a sacred light. No one has the right to own another person. They were the Quakers. Since their beginnings in England in the 17th century, the Quakers lived by principles of peace, honesty, and equality. They refused to swear loyalty to kings. They refused to fight in wars. And from the earliest days of their arrival in America, they rejected slavery, not as a political issue, but as a moral crime. They didn't just talk about it, they lived it. They freed the people they had once enslaved. They encouraged others to do the same. And when enslaved people began to flee northward, searching for freedom, it was the Quakers who opened their homes first. From small wooden houses in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, a secret network began to form. No signs, no official maps, only quiet acts of courage, one house at a time. That network would come to be known as the Underground Railroad, a name that carried no tracks, no trains, but a lifeline for those desperate to breathe free. No one knows exactly how many Quakers risked their lives. No one kept a tally of how many enslaved people passed through their homes. But one thing is certain, without their silent bravery, the story of America would look very different. Long before the sound of battle drums echoed across America, before any law declared slavery illegal, enslaved people in the South had already begun to carve out their own paths to freedom. Paths with no maps, no signs, only darkness and hope guiding their way. And in that dangerous journey, a secret network quietly took shape, a web of doors that opened at midnight, a chain of hearts brave enough to risk everything. History would later call it the Underground Railroad. But despite the name, there were no tracks, no steam engines. It wasn't a railroad at all. It was a system built of trust, courage, and compassion. Within this hidden world, the safe houses were called stations. The people who opened their homes were station masters. Those who guided the enslaved through forests and fields were conductors, and those fleeing slavery were known as passengers. It was more than a clever code. It was a shield, a way to protect everyone involved. If one person was caught, they could not reveal names or places because they didn't know. Everything ran on whispers, signs, and faith. And at the heart of this network were the Quakers. Not because they were thrill seekers, but because their conscience wouldn't let them stand by. From as early as the late 1700s, Quaker communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York began quietly sheltering those who ran toward freedom, even though helping a fugitive slave was considered a federal crime. Their work wasn't dramatic. Each night, they welcomed strangers into their homes. People broken by exhaustion, barefoot, starving, terrified. They offered food, a place to sleep, and guidance for the next leg of their journey. Many Quakers even altered their homes to hide the people they were sheltering. Some built false walls, secret basements, hidden compartments under stairs. And always, the light of a lantern in the window or a white cloth tied to a fence signaled to those in the shadows, "You're safe here." The Quakers were not alone. In time, the Underground Railroad grew to include free black communities, abolitionist activists, preachers, farmers, and countless unsung heroes. But at its foundation, the quiet, steady courage of the Quakers had laid the first tracks. And what's most remarkable is that they never asked for thanks. They didn't want recognition. They simply believed that if they could help one more person breathe free, it was worth every risk. If history were a grand book, the story of the Quakers might seem like small print between the big headlines, stories of war, presidents, and declarations. But sometimes it's the small print that changes everything. In the network of the Underground Railroad, there were countless Quakers who quietly turned their lives and homes into beacons of freedom. One of the most well-known was Levi Coffin, a Quaker merchant from Indiana. People called him the president of the Underground Railroad. Along with his wife, Catherine, he transformed their home into a safe haven. Over their lifetimes, they're believed to have helped more than 3,000 people escape bondage. Their home had hidden rooms, false walls, and secret passages, all built to protect strangers they might never see again. But Coffin was only one among many. Across the North, in towns and farmlands, hundreds of Quaker families quietly risked everything. Farmers who opened their barns after midnight, wives who cooked warm meals for terrified guests, children who learned to keep secrets far too heavy for their young hearts. These were people who knew the cost. If caught, they could lose their property, face heavy fines, be shunned by neighbors, or worse. And yet, they opened their doors night after night. They weren't naive. They knew they couldn't save everyone. They knew the dangers, but they believed deeply and simply that to help even one person escape slavery was worth any sacrifice. And they didn't do it for glory. They did it because their faith left them no other choice. For the Quakers, heroism wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the quiet decision to do what was right again and again, even when no one was watching. To join the Underground Railroad wasn't simply a good deed, it was a dangerous choice. Every time a Quaker opened their door to a fleeing slave, they also opened the door to possible ruin. The law was not on their side. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, tightened further in 1850, made it a federal crime to help an escaped slave. Anyone caught providing shelter, food, or even simple directions could face heavy fines, loss of property, or imprisonment. That meant, each night, when a Quaker lit a lantern and welcomed a frightened soul into their home, they were breaking the law. Not just risking their own safety, but the well-being of their family, their livelihood, their entire community. But the law wasn't the only threat. There were neighbors who whispered behind closed doors, questioning why certain families left their lanterns burning late into the night. There were bounty hunters, ruthless men who made their living by capturing escaped slaves and punishing those who dared help them. For many Quaker families, fear became a constant companion. They lived knowing that one knock at the door could bring to disaster, whether from the authorities or from those who disapproved of their quiet rebellion. And yet, despite the risks, they continued. Not because they underestimated the danger, but because they understood that freedom always comes at a cost. There are stories of entire Quaker communities living under the weight of that fear, never knowing if tonight's act of kindness would bring tomorrow's punishment. But they believed that doing nothing would have been the far greater crime. They knew the dangers. They faced them anyway. Today, when people talk about American history, they mention declarations, presidents, and wars. Rarely do they mention the quiet courage of those who changed history one secret night at a time. It's estimated that through the years leading up to the Civil War, over 100,000 enslaved people found their freedom through the Underground Railroad. We'll never know how many of those journeys passed through Quaker homes, because those acts of bravery were never written down. No plaques, no parades, no headlines. But the legacy of the Quakers is not measured in numbers. It's measured in the echo of their belief that every person, regardless of skin color, has the right to live free. Their small nightly acts of defiance planted seeds that grew into the great human rights movements that followed. They proved that sometimes it is not the voices shouting in the streets that change the world, but the whispers spoken in the dark, the hands quietly reaching out to help. And the question they leave us is not one of history, but of who we choose to be today. So what makes a hero? Is it someone whose name fills the pages of history books? Someone whose statue stands tall in a public square? Or is it the person who opens their door in the dead of night, knowing no one will ever know their name, but doing what's right anyway? The Quakers weren't warriors or politicians. They were farmers, merchants, mothers, fathers, children. People who, when faced with injustice, quietly chose to act. They didn't free an entire people, but they freed one person at a time. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. The chains of slavery may have been broken long ago, but the invisible chains of prejudice, of indifference, of fear still linger. The story of the Quakers is not just about the past. It's about the question they leave us. When you see injustice, will you open your door? When someone is trapped in darkness, will you light a candle? When the world turns away, will you choose to act, even if no one is watching? You don't have to be a hero in the eyes of history. You only have to be the light in someone's night. Because freedom is not a destination. It's the choice we make, again and again, every single day.